Thank you, Cesare. Buongiorno. I apologize, I'm speaking in English, but I hope you can cope all right. This is not my passport photograph, by the way. This is another individual entirely. If I can just get this slide to move on. Oops. Sorry, let's come back a bit.
Click the mouse.
That one? Okay, there we go. Okay. Now, I'm going to be talking about the development of presbyopia, but obviously you cannot understand presbyopia without talking about accommodation in general. So my talk is really two halves. One, the basics of accommodation, and the second, about presbyopia specifically, the end stage, if you like to think of it in that stage, in those terms. And of course, the basics of the accommodation system are a change in the form of the crystalline lens. On the left, you'll see Descartes' view in the 17th century, and he clearly recognized that in order to see clearly at near, the lens of the eye had to become more convex and increase its power. And indeed, since then, numerous people have established that very clearly. I put on the right-hand side there a typical slit lamp view where on the left-hand half of the figure, it's for near vision, and on the right-hand side, it's for relaxed accommodation. And as I say, numerous people have followed this through and demonstrated that it's the lens of the eye that changes the optical power, not the cornea, maybe not the axial length and all the other possibilities, but it's the lens. And if we therefore ask what structures in the eye might be involved here, we've obviously got the lens itself, and we see that it's supported by the very fine zonular fibers attached to the ciliary body, the ciliary muscle, and presumably, in some way or other, it's the interaction between the ciliary body primarily, those zonular fibers which link it to the lens, which transmits forces which somehow change the shape of the lens. I think it's interesting that going back to Thomas Young in 1800 or so, people could still think of the lens of itself being a muscle, but the lens is not a muscle. It can't change itself from its own internal forces. And if we look at diagrams of the lens of the eye, what we see, of course, is the lens proper enclosed by a thin capsule, which of course plays a vital role when thinking about intraocular lenses and so on. And that assembly of lens plus capsule is supported by the radial array of fine zonular fibers, which at the other end are attached to the ciliary body. And it's also important to notice that the lens, although it's comprised of fibers, those fibers can't slide with respect to one another. They have little bumps and ball and socket joints and things, so the whole lens acts as a single body, even though it's not homogeneous either mechanically or optically, but it acts as a single body. There's no sliding of its elements across each other. And in the 19th century, of course, Helmholtz probably formulated the clearest idea of what he believed was the basic mechanism, which he suggested that when free of forces from the zonular fibers, which are supporting the lens, when free of these forces, when these fibers were slack, the isolated elastic lens, rather like an eraser, it's elastic, was shaped by its own elastic forces and the forces imposed by the elastic capsule into a more convex form. So you take the lens out of the eye, of a young eye, and it's in its accommodated state. That's the natural state. It's the tension of these zonular fibers brought about by the action of the ciliary muscle that exerts a force on the periphery of the lens, the equator of the lens, and flattens it by pulling out radially into a flatter form suitable for distance vision. And that was Helmholtz's idea, as I say, about the mid-19th century, 1860 or so. And here's an alternative view. On the right-hand side, you'll see a section of the eye, of the relevant part of the eye. At the bottom, we have the unaccommodated state, where the ciliary muscle is in a relaxed state, and the little zonular fibers attached to the equator of the lens are all under tension, all tugging vigorously on the periphery of the lens in order to flatten it. And that state of affairs, if we looked face on to the lens, is shown on the left-hand side, and we've got the lens sitting in the middle, surrounded by the tense zonular fibers, and the inner edge of the ciliary muscle, the so-called ciliary ring, is relatively large. Now what happens when we want to look at near objects, when we want to accommodate? The ciliary muscle, shown at the top of the picture, bunches up and moves slightly forward. That relaxes the tension in the zonular fibers, and the elastic forces of the lens can put it into a more convex form. Now that, of course, is the young eye. So I've summarized this here. In the relaxed state, the ciliary ring is of large diameter, creating tension in the zonular fibers and flattening the lens. In the accommodated state, the ciliary ring contracts and the tension in the zonule is reduced. So the lens reduces its diameter and takes up its more powerful convex form. So what we have then is actually quite a complex of things. The form of the lens is governed by zonular tension, the form and elasticity of the capsule, and the lens itself. And of course, the ciliary muscle, the ciliary body don't exist in isolation, so there are other forces involved relating to the attachment of the ciliary muscle to the choroid and so on. And some have alleged the vitreous body may also play a role. Okay, well, that's the way we hope we'll be able to accommodate. But what about presbyopia? Now, we had a definition earlier, and I've just put down here from Miladow's Dictionary of Optometry how he defines presbyopia: a refractive condition in which the accommodative ability of the eye is insufficient for near vision due to aging. And Miladow suggests that perhaps 4 diopters or so of amplitude is the sort of insufficient for most people. But of course, as Shazad was saying, if you've got long arms, you can hold things further away, and so you might tolerate a smaller amplitude. Okay, and if we're talking about amplitudes, we ought briefly to refer to how we measure them. And of course, the classic way is to have a push-up method where either you move an object steadily in or steadily out, or you use lenses to measure a subjective amplitude of accommodation where the patient has to tell you that things are just starting to blur. Oh, that looks blur because I brought it too near. And we can also talk about the objective amplitude of accommodation, which is the actual difference in power of the eye. And the difference between those two, of course, is that we know, even as presbyopes, we have a finite depth of focus over which we can move an object and still see it clearly. So just as in case of cameras, we've got a little bit of extra amplitude, which appears in the subjective amplitude due to depth of focus. And certainly since the time of Donders, again in the mid-19th century, people have been measuring the changes in subjective amplitude of accommodation with age. And using different techniques, different subject populations, and so on. I just put down 4 of them here. And the important thing is that all of these are much the same given the precision of the measurement. And I find this interesting because if we measured it today in this audience, say, we'd find a similar sort of curve. And in spite of greater longevity, perhaps different health, different diets and so on, this seems to be pretty much thoroughly programmed in. We might perhaps mature earlier nowadays than was once the case in physical terms. We might live longer, but we have the same amplitude age curve. And using Miladow's sort of 4 diopters or so as the tolerance where we start to experience near vision problems, then obviously this is somewhere around the early 40s. Now, if you look at, those were cross-sectional results, transverse results, where you took groups of people of different ages, measured their amplitudes. If you follow an individual subject, and this is me in not my prime, but younger years, if you follow an individual subject, it's quite interesting that they tend to decay pretty well linearly. If you measure it subjectively, you get slightly higher values. But as you age through your 40s, the decline in amplitude is almost linear. And I think, of course, it's important also to remind ourselves that this whole process starts in adolescence, really. Even the youngest of the audience here is losing accommodation as we speak. You're losing something like half a diopter a year, that sort of thing. So it's what we talk of as the clinical problem of presbyopia is the later stages of a process which has been going on for a long time. And again, as was mentioned earlier, of course, the impact of this depends very much on the age distribution then on the population. And what I've just put on here, just to remind ourselves of this, if we plot the number of people in 5-year age groups as a sort of tree, then we can ask ourselves how many people are above the age of 40, what fraction of the population is above the age of 40. And this shows some relatively undeveloped countries with very young populations, and on there is the median age for the population, so the age at which half the population are older, half the population are younger. And in many countries, and of course in Europe in the past, that's been the typical state of affairs. So it's only been a small fraction of the population that suffers from presbyopic problems. Was that gone funny? Oh dear. Well, I was going to say that in the case of European countries now, we're in a state of affairs where more than half the population is presbyopic. So it has now become a major concern where we all, practically all, once we get through our early years, are likely to run into the presbyopic regime. Well, we now face the question, why does this amplitude fall away through life? And we remind ourselves, and I've not got a slide here, we remind ourselves that the lens of the eye is changing throughout life, that throughout life new lens fibers are being added to the lens. It's not a static body, it's growing continuously throughout life. So that if we compare in a magnetic resonance image as shown here, a 26-year-old with a 49-year-old, what we see is, with relaxed accommodation, that the lens of the 49-year-old is a lot thicker, extra material has been added, new lens fibers, and the ciliary muscle, ciliary body, has moved forward slightly in the eye. And of course the anterior chamber depth has decreased as this occurs. So there are very real changes in the geometry of the eye and in the lump of tissue, the lens, that has to change shape. So perhaps we need not be surprised that there's going to be problems. And if we look at slit lamp images of eyes at different ages, on the left 19 years, 33, 44, 69 years, and at the top, in the not accommodated state, the relaxed state, in the accommodated state at the bottom, what we see is in the young eye on the left-hand side that the anterior surface of the lens bulges forward, becomes more convex in accommodation, whereas on the right-hand side, of course, the 69-year-old, there's no change. Try as hard as the individual might, there's no accommodation occurring. There's a lot more scattering, of course, and other problems, but I did just want to point out, say, in the 33-year-old, that one interesting fact is that the change in shape, if you look at the bottom, it's more convex, the anterior surface, but the thickness of the lens cortex is much the same, and most of the shape change is associated with a change in the nucleus of the lens, which actually is the oldest, hardest part of the lens. So the nucleus has to change in order to produce the overall change in the shape of the lens. It's not a change just in the surface layers of the lens. So what are the age-dependent factors involved? Well, it could be the ciliary muscle is packing up. Remember, it's got to pull on those zonular fibers, and if the ciliary muscle becomes weaker, as one's muscles do perhaps in general with age, then there would be problems. It could be changes in the elasticity of the fibers which anchor the ciliary body. It could be a reduction in the space between the equator of the lens, the periphery of the lens, and the ciliary body. It could be changes in the geometry of the zonular attachment. But in particular, it could be greater rigidity of the lens, because that's the thing that's changing most as the eye ages, getting thicker, heavier, and possibly losing its elasticity. It could also, of course, be the loss of capsular elasticity. And lastly, there could be the question of vitreous support. So these are the changes, and I've just put them down here again. So I want to look at these possibilities one by one and see what sort of evidence there is that any one of them might play an important role. And I should say, obviously, the difficulty in following this has been twofold. One is you can't easily see the ciliary muscle behind the iris, or you couldn't in the past. And the other, it's difficult to look at the internal structure of the lens without disrupting that structure by sectioning or whatever. So there still remain very much uncertainties about the internal mechanical and other characteristics of the lens, simply because of the difficulties of accessing them. Now, there are two classical theories I should just mention. Don't worry too much about these, but Hess and Gullstrand suggested that it was really only lens stiffness and rigidity that mattered, and they just said that as you get older, you'll accommodate to a particular level, and then the lens will become too rigid to change, so that it keeps on, you put in an equal amount of effort, but you just can't go beyond a certain fixed end point. So as you're presbyopic, all the force in your lens is just unusable. It's latent. It can't be used because the lens isn't changing. Whereas Duane Fincham suggested that in order to change by, say, a diopter, because of the increasing rigidity of the lens, you had to put more and more effort into it. So if you were fully accommodated, you were using all the available strength of your ciliary muscle. Well, there's one more theory which I think I should mention to you, and that's Schacker's theory, which was a development of Schoening's. And basically what Schacker said was that he disagreed about what happened when the ciliary muscle changed shape, when it exerted force. He suggested that rather than slackening all the zonule, that actually there were fibers whose tension increased and they pulled even more on the edge of the lens, and that the accommodated lens was larger in diameter, and what was happening was that the central region was pushed out into almost a cone of steep radius of curvature at its apex. So the lens was changing from, or lens surface was changing from an almost spherical shape into a very distorted aspheric shape. Now, the evidence for that is meagre to say the least. But he did emphasize, and this has affected some surgical techniques, the importance of the gap between the ciliary ring and the lens equator. So let's just have a quick look at that. On the left, you've got the relaxed lens. Helmholtz says if the ciliary muscle exerts its force, the tension in the zonule decreases, and the periphery of the lens moves inwards. The lens gets smaller in diameter. Schacker said, no, that's not right. There are some fibers whose tension increases, and so the periphery of the lens moves outwards, as shown by the little arrows, and the lens surface becomes not spherical, but very much almost like a cone with a slightly curved central area, which gives the increased power. And let's look then at the individual components. What about the ciliary muscle? Does it lose strength? That's, remember, what some early authors suggested. And the answer has been known for some time, it does not lose strength. It changes shape slightly and it changes position as a result of the lens changing position. But if you look on the left-hand side there, you'll see the force basically that the muscle can exert, and that remains pretty much unchanged, well, up here up to the age of 60, and later measurements further out have shown that the ciliary muscle can still exert force. And of course that's enormously important in the surgical context where you're trying to develop accommodating intraocular lenses and so on. At least you've got force from the ciliary body. What about elasticity in the anchoring fibers, which was what Beto and Miranda suggested? At the top, you'll see the Young situation. They're suggesting that the anchoring fibers pull on the ciliary muscle and help it in its movement, and that perhaps part of presbyopia is caused by those shown at the bottom, where those fibers becoming slack. They lose their elasticity, and of course they can't help the ciliary muscle proper to change shape in the way it should. It may be so. Nobody's actually demonstrated this at the present time. It remains a theory. What about the gap between the ciliary ring and the lens? And indeed, particularly in recent years, magnetic resonance imaging has suggested that that gap is decreasing with time. And remember, that gap is necessary for the maintenance of the tension in the zonular fibers. So if the gaps get smaller, the possibility is the zonular fibers can no longer pull as vigorously on the periphery of the lens to flatten it for distance vision. However, the points of attachment of those zonular fibers on the lens, these are face-on views of the lens, changes with age. And broadly speaking, the evidence then for the sort of theory that the fibers are getting slacker as a result of these changes is not very strong. So it does not perhaps appear that that effect is too strong. What we do have here, though, is, again, a little bit of supporting evidence for the importance of this gap, because what we have here is some work by Fisher again, where the gap between, in a mechanical arrangement, the gap between the lens and the ciliary body has been changed in a in vitro experiment, and you're comparing different ages here with a 19-year-old, a particular change in the gap between the periphery of the lens and the muscle produces a big change in the power of the lens, whereas as you get older, the gap diminishes between the two. So you might make a big gap, and there's very little effect here. What about the lens? This is the key. And you can measure a lot of things about the lens. Young's moduli, other mechanical things. You can measure its stiffness and so on. And various people have done this. And these are some measurements by Fisher in the 70s, some measurements by Glasser and Campbell around 2000, but there are other measurements. And what they show is Young's modulus is really saying here, how easy is it to distort the lens through the pull of these zonular forces? Well, obviously, for quite a long time, through the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, there's very little change. And curiously, at the age of 40, then it becomes much more resistant. You've got to drag much more strongly to deform the lens. Now, this is surprising because you'll remember that the change in subjective accommodation, amplitude of accommodation with age, was pretty well linear from an earlier age, quite an early age. So we don't change suddenly at 40 or so, that we've been getting beginning to get presbyopic for a long time. And yet the mechanical elasticity constants don't seem to change much until 40. So there's a bit of a mystery here, which one has to be honest about. What about stiffness? Now, on the left-hand side, what we've got is lenses of different ages, and the idea has been you've got a piston which pushes down on the lens, and what's been measured is the force required to slightly flatten the lens by successive small amounts. Look at the young lens right down the bottom, and what you'll see is that, in fact, you need very little force at all to deform that lens. So that lens is pretty flexible, jelly-like thing. Come up to 41 and you can see the little steps as successive movements have been made. And come up to 96 and you can see how hard it is to deform the lens because it's got very, very stiff. And here is the plot of these measurements as a function of age from 0 to 100 and the resistance to distortion. And you can see there's this, obviously, this progressive increase. But again, a little bit puzzling when at the age of 20 you're losing amplitude, but the stiffness is obviously still very low. So there are some unknowns. Even now, the sort of our understanding is imperfect. But it isn't just, of course, the mechanical characteristics of the lens that are changing. It's also the optical characteristics. And what these show are contours, as you cut through the lens, of refractive index. That we think of a lens as having a refractive index of 1.5 if it's crown glass or 1.6 if it's flint glass or whatever. Now, in the lens of the human eye, the center of the region of the lens has higher index than does the periphery of the lens. And the striking thing, if you look at this, the top left one is a 7-year-old, the bottom right one is an 80-year-old, that these contours are obviously moving towards the periphery of the lens as you get older. In the young lens, there's a big gradient of refractive index. In the old lens, it's almost homogeneous. Now, for those who know about optics, this is important because this refractive index changes confers power. Just from an index gradient, you can get optical power. So if you haven't got an index gradient, then the behavior of the lens, even though the surface curvatures may be the same, will be entirely different. So obviously, the optical characteristics of the lens are changing as well as its mechanical characteristics. And what this shows is if we take the lens and the capsule together, the fine line is the lens with its capsule. The thick line is what the lens looks like if you take the capsule off. And I just want you to look and see for the 5-year-old, removing the capsule, obviously the elastic lens changes shape. So the capsule is normally exerting force on the body of the lens to change its shape. As you get older, 23, for example, those changes become smaller. And by the time you're 84, if you ever get there, removing the capsule has no effect. So obviously the capsular forces play an important role on the younger lens, but they're not capable to exert any effect on the much more rigid old lens. And the elasticity of the capsule its ability to change the shape of the lens does seem to be maintained reasonably well throughout life. Some have actually raised this a little bit, but certainly it isn't that the capsule is losing elasticity. There's a slight small, but nothing very great. So that's important that capsule elasticity is there, again, from the point of view of surgical interventions later in life. And other factors I just wanted to mention that, generally speaking, and I didn't have time to show these, but the Duane-Fincham idea that we use up whatever force from the ciliary muscle that we've got is the correct one. There's no latent ciliary body force available. So what I want to finally then say is that there are a number of factors which play a role in presbyopia, no doubt about that. So there's an element of truth probably in most ideas, and we mustn't think of it purely in the as the lens being purely responsible. What is important, I think, I emphasize again, is that when we're thinking about surgical interventions where perhaps we replace the natural crystalline lens with other devices, that the ciliary muscle remains active and the capsule remains elastic quite well into old age. So there's possibilities there for surgical intervention for, if well-designed, accommodating IOLs, or things which I'm not sure whether they appear on the agenda today, but things like refilling the capsule perhaps with a liquid or with plastic material of some sort to replace the natural lens, and all those sorts of things. And finally, it's interesting to note that if we do remove the natural crystalline lens, it does change the geometry of the ciliary body back towards its more youthful position. Well, thank you for listening. I hope I've given you some idea of what's involved here, and thank you for inviting me, I should say. Thank you.